Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery, where today I'm probably going to challenge everything you think you know about the case of Kitty Genovese, if you know anything at all. If you've ever studied any form of psychology or sociology in school, then the likelihood is that you've heard of the story of Kitty, which in a nutshell tends to go as following. 38 respectable citizens of New York City watched her be murdered and nobody did a thing about it, leading to a social psychological theory called the bystander effect. The bystander effect states that individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when there are other people present, that a single person is more likely to help than a crowd, and Kitty Genovese became a symbol of this after her death. Whilst there's been many experiments to prove that the bystander effect is indeed a thing, there are many reasons why the murder of Kitty probably isn't the best example of it. The myth of Kitty Genovese began on March 27th, 1964, just a couple of weeks after her murder on March 13th. The New York Times ran an article entitled, "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police. Apathy at Stabbing of Queenswoman Shocks Inspector," with the opening paragraph reading, "For more than half an hour, 38 respectable law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens." And from there, the legend of the murder of Kitty would grow, being taught in psychology classes around the world to each new generation. But the problem with the article is that there are so many false facts just in that single opening paragraph. 38 people did not watch Kitty be stalked and stabbed. It's not like they stood around in a circle and watched it happen. It was 3 AM, most people were asleep, and it wasn't a particularly well built up area she was murdered in. There weren't even 3 separate attacks, there were only 2. Why, out of 636 murders that happened in New York City that year, is Kitty the only name we know today? But before we get into all of the untruths surrounding this case, let's talk a little bit about Kitty herself, the woman that she was before she became a cautionary tale. Catherine Genovese, known as Kitty to pretty much everyone, was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York on 7th of July in 1935. She was the oldest child in her Italian-American family, the daughter of Rachel and Vincent Genovese. She attended an all-girls school, Prospect Heights High School, where she was described as one of the more popular kids. She had plenty of friends and plenty of confidence. In 1954, after she'd graduated, Kitty's family decided to up and move the family to Connecticut. But Kitty was now an adult and decided she wanted to stay in New York. It was home and she loved it there. She also ended up getting married that same year, but it was annulled within months and it didn't work out. She took some clerical jobs which she hated before eventually finding a job she loved in the form of bartending. I can imagine for someone as confident and social as Kitty, bartending would have been something she really enjoyed. But after a brief blip in 1961 where she got arrested and fined for bookmaking, taking bets on horses from her patrons, she gets fired and ends up getting another bartending position at a job called Ev's 11th Hour on Jamaica Avenue on 193rd Street in Queens. She was an independent woman living her best life in New York City. Now, something which is often brushed over in all of the discussion about Kitty is that she was a gay woman, she was a lesbian. The Chicago Tribune says the reason her very short marriage came to an end is because she came to terms with her sexuality. But you'll find absolutely no mention of this in any of the articles from the 60s, and you actually rarely find it mentioned in articles today. But this bit of information provides a very important bit of context to the story, as you'll come to find out as we go through it. Kitty even lived with her girlfriend, Mary Ann Dialonco, who she'd met in 1963. The story of how they met is so wonderfully gay that I just have to share it with you. They met at a lesbian bar in Manhattan called Swing Rendezvous, where Mary Ann was immediately smitten with Kitty. They danced together but ended up partying without getting each other's details. But Kitty, being the strong, confident woman that she was, wasn't about to let Mary Ann go, so she hunted down her details, found out where she lived, and taped a note to her apartment door reading, "We'll call you at the street corner phone booth at 7, Kitty G." Mary Ann made sure she was there and they agreed to go on a date, meeting at the 7 Steps, which is a gay bar on Houston Street. And they immediately hit it off, bonding over the difficulties of coming to terms with their sexualities. As I've already said, Kitty was a strong, confident kind of character. She talked a lot, whereas Marianne was much more reserved and quiet. But they were both bartenders, with Marianne working at Club Chris. They meshed together really well. Almost immediately after their first date, they moved in together because of course they did, insert lesbian U-Haul joke here. They lived in a motel room together for a couple of weeks before finding a lovely one-bedroom apartment in Kew Gardens in Queens above Old Bailey's bar. It was a safe and relatively quiet area of the city. Marianne has said that the year that she spent with Kitty in their little one-bed apartment was the happiest year of her life. They both worked days for the most part, so they could then spend their nights together. But of course, this was 1964 New York, it was pre-Stonewall and the Gay Revolution. Homosexuality was still a crime under New York law. When I started looking into this case, I didn't expect it to hit me quite as much as it did. Obviously, I researched true crime and history for a living. I've built up quite a thick skin, but Kitty's case felt really personal to me. She was 28, not much older than I am. She was a queer woman coming up to her first anniversary with her girlfriend. So much of her story resonated with me. I mean, Kitty reminds me so much of my girlfriend, and I definitely shed a few tears whilst researching this, but hopefully I've got it all out of my system now. And yes, when I say girlfriend, I mean girlfriend. It amazes me how many times I could literally mention the fact I have a girlfriend in my videos, and people in the comments will start talking about my friend or the fact I'm a really good ally. Guys, come on. Anyway, I digress. Let's continue. Early in the morning of March 13th, 1964, about 2:30 AM, Kitty finished her shift at the bar and began the drive home in her red Fiat. It took her about 45 minutes, arriving home at around 3:15 AM, and she parked her car in the car park of the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station, as there was no street parking outside her apartment. She only parked about 30 metres away from the door to her apartment, which was in an alleyway at the back of her building. She gets out of her car and starts the walk to her house, probably excited to curl up in bed next to Marianne and get to sleep. But sadly for Kitty, a man called Winston Mosley had spotted her on her journey home. He stalked her through the streets before parking his car at a corner bus stop on Austin Street, before getting out and following her down the street, a hunting knife in hand. There's no particular reason it seems that he picked Kitty as his victim. She was just there, she drove past him and he noticed. There was no reason as to why she should have been the one that died. Being early morning hours and with no one else on the street, Kitty noticed this man following her and broke into a run. As I mentioned, the entrance to her apartment was around the back of the building, but Kitty ran down the front. It's likely she knew that she was in trouble, so thought she was safest to run to the bar which was there. The amount of people there would surely deter the man. But sadly for Kitty, the bar had actually decided to close early that night and there was no one there to let her in. Mosley caught up with her and stabbed her twice in the back, one of the hits puncturing one of her lungs. It would be this wound that would eventually kill her. As the attack happened, Kitty screamed out and Mosley swiftly left the scene. When you think of New York City, you tend to think of big built-up areas, skyscrapers in every corner, but that's not the case in Queens, and particularly Kew Gardens. The street is a row of two-storey buildings, shops, bars and food places on the ground level and apartments above them, one of them being the one that Kitty shared with Marianne. On the other side of the road stood the Mowbray Apartments, 9 stories high. A man called Robert Moser in one of these apartments opened his window and shouted, "Let that girl alone," but then it goes quiet and he assumes that he stopped whatever was happening. An important bit of context to bear in mind with this case is that this was the 1960s and people tended to keep to themselves a lot more than they do nowadays, especially in the cities. A few people who would have been awake or easily awoken at 3:20 AM heard Kitty scream, but assumed it was a domestic dispute, a lover's quarrel or a drunk person in the street. You didn't get involved in things like that. It was between a man and his wife, and I'm sure it happened quite a lot. From what I can gather, Kew Gardens at this time was a fairly domestic place, but it also happened right outside of a bar where I'm sure many arguments and brawls happened. It wasn't completely crazy to hear a scream in the middle of the night. According to an article in the Washington Post that I read, in 1964, marital rape was not a crime in New York, and domestic violence cases went to family court rather than criminal. Being beaten by your other half wasn't even considered grounds for divorce at this point. You just generally stayed out of other people's problems, and you didn't stand up to a man beating his wife. You just didn't really do it. Whether that's right or wrong, that's up to you, but it's just the way it was. It kind of made me think of foxes. If you live in the UK, you've probably heard the sound of foxes mating, which sounds incredibly like a woman's scream. In my old home, we used to have a family of foxes that lived in the garden, and I would hear this shrieking late at night. I would never even get out of bed to check, I just assumed it was always the foxes. But this case has made me think, what if one time it wasn't the foxes and I ignored it? Whilst Robert Moses shouted out of his window, he couldn't necessarily see what was going on. Being the middle of the night, it was dark, and of course there were street lights, but they didn't light the area incredibly well. The lights weren't as powerful as the type of street lights you generally see nowadays. But we do know that at least one man did actually see exactly what was going on. A man called Joseph Fink worked in the Mowbray apartment buildings across the street. Some sources say he was a doorman or elevator operator or superintendent. I suppose it's not too important which. The important thing is this man saw Kitty being attacked, probably saw her actually being stabbed, but he did nothing at all. He said he briefly considered going to get his baseball bat to intervene, but he ended up just going down to his basement apartment for a nap instead. He didn't report anything, and then Mosley just walked away from the scene. Kitty, injured but still alive at this point, manages to just about get herself upright and begins to stumble away from the scene, making it around to the back of the building. She didn't bother trying to make it all the way to the entrance to her apartment, but instead goes inside the first entrance she can, entering the stairwell to her friend's apartment. In this time, Winston Mosley has inexplicably returned to his car, moved it, changed into a different hat, and then has returned to hunt Kitty down to where she was now working her way up the stairwell. He finds her and continues his brutal attack there, stabbing and eventually sexually assaulting her. She's unable to scream or call for help at this point due to her punctured lung. Whilst all of this is going on, Carl Ross, Kitty's friend, is inside his apartment off of the stairwell that Kitty and her attacker are currently in. He hears a commotion outside, so opens his apartment door to see what's going on. He sees Kitty being attacked. He's the only person who bore witness to this second attack, but he just shuts the door again in a panic. Now, Carl has been villainised a lot over the years for what he did next, and a lot of people struggle to understand why his movements were what they were. But as always is, the context is important here. Carl doesn't immediately call the police, instead he calls a friend who lived in Long Island to ask them what he should do. The friend advises him that he's best to just do nothing, but why would this be? Despite many older sources reporting that the friend Carl contacted in Long Island was his girlfriend, that doesn't seem to be correct. There's actually lots of reasons to believe that Carl Ross was actually a gay man, in a time when it was illegal to be gay in New York. He had a lot to fear, both from the general public and the police, who were not kind to gay people, gay men in particular. If the police turned up at this scene and found reason to suspect that Carl could be gay, not only could he be arrested for disorderly conduct, which was the crime that homosexuals were usually charged with, but he could be accused of the murder himself. If he was a gay man, which is what all of the evidence tends to point to here, then this would have all been running through his head. Maybe you could argue that it's selfish, but humans are inherently selfish. You've got to put yourself in the moment and think, what would I do? It's not like the police in New York City in the 60s were the best in the world either. There was a lot of corruption going on at this time, and even if you did call the police, there wasn't a guarantee that they were going to show up. The police weren't necessarily your friend, even if you were a straight white male. So for a gay male who probably spent all of his time trying to avoid coming into contact with the police, you would hesitate to call them. And this was before 911, the direct line to the emergency services. That would eventually come into place on the back of Kitty's case and some others. The first 911 call wasn't placed until February 1968. In 64, if you wanted to contact the police, you had to call your local precinct if you had the number handy. But if you didn't have it handy, then you had to call the operator and get transferred over to your local precinct. and this could be a lengthy process, which was worth it if the police actually decided to turn up when you needed them, but a lot of the time they just didn't. The police could pick and choose what crimes were worth their time. The NYPD was corrupt to its very core. But what seemed to be the one crime they were really concerned about in the city in 1964? Homosexuality. With the 1964 World Fair coming to New York to Queens just the next month, the NYPD were desperate to cleanse the city of any depravity, saying that the growth of overt homosexuality was causing a crisis. They were coming down hard on homosexual men, doing anything they could to catch them. To Carl Ross, the police may have been the enemy. See, context is important. But that's not all to say that Carl didn't eventually contact the police, he just hesitated. After speaking to his friend in Long Island, he hung up and called another friend, a neighbour, who told him to come over right away. So he climbs out of his window and along the roof to get there, not wanting to see the scene in the lobby. Once at the neighbour's house, they contacted the police, who arrived not long after. It's also worth noting that Carl was drunk that night as well, which may have been responsible for some impaired decision making. When Carl was later questioned by the police as to why he didn't call them quicker, he simply said, "I didn't want to get involved," the singular line which I'm sure haunted him for the rest of his life. The later New York Times article would cling on to this, and it would be a symbol of the bystander effect forevermore. It wasn't as simple as that though, as we know, and he did eventually call the police. News of Kitty's attack spread quickly along the apartment and soon to a woman called Sophia Farrar. Sophia and her husband would later report having heard Kitty's screams that night, but when they looked out of their bedroom window they couldn't see anything, so they just went back to bed. But when a neighbour called their apartment to say Kitty had been attacked, Sophia got dressed immediately and ran down the street to where she knew Kitty was. This is a woman who, despite having a husband and young children at home, heard of her friend being in trouble and left her home without a second's thought to go and help her. Sophia didn't know if Kitty's attacker had left the scene yet. She didn't know if she was walking into danger. She just got up and ran to help. She found Kitty in the lobby, barely conscious and in a pool of blood, but she held her, spoke to her and rocked her while she waited for an ambulance to arrive. It soon did, but sadly Kitty died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Despite the whole narrative of the story being that nobody cared enough to help, not a single article from the time mentions this young woman walking into danger to hold her friend as she died. This wasn't apathy, it was the opposite. There was this huge narrative across the USA at the time about how cities were evil, soul-destroying places. Urban apathy was a huge concern about how people living in big cities didn't care about their neighbours or the people around them. How in a case like this, or at least the narrative that's always pushed of this, everyone always thinks it's someone else's problem. Which does seem shocking when you have the New York Times pushing headlines like 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. But we've probably all got the idea by now that that wasn't the case. In fact, New York's one of the most socially advanced cities in the whole world. It was this place of incredible activism and fights for civil rights. New York City cannot be accused of urban apathy. This was just more of a case of having ear witnesses rather than eyewitnesses. Many people may have heard Kitty scream, but people like the Farrars may have looked out of their window and seen nothing of concern and decided to go back to bed. Only 2 people that we know of actually bore witness to the attack. Joseph Fink, who just decided to go for a nap instead of doing anything, and Carl Ross, who closed the door but did eventually call the police. And there are reports of other people calling the police as well, neighbours who have said in the years after that they called, but only one of these calls was logged in the police log, and that was a call from Carl Ross. One neighbour has reported that when she called, she was told that somebody else had already called about the incident. So is it possible that they just didn't log any subsequent calls because they already had the police on their way? But where did this number 38 even come from, I hear you ask? 38 witnesses, 37 of them who did nothing. Well, it's not entirely clear. It may have been the number of people who later came forward saying they heard something, or some sources say that it was simply the number of police reports, the number of pieces of paper filed around this case. What we do know for certain is that 38 people did not stand around in a circle and just watch Kitty get murdered. That's not what happened. It didn't take long after the murder for Mary Ann to hear what had happened. On the night of March 12th, she had been out bowling with a friend and fell asleep around 11 p.m. She was awoken by two officers the next morning asking her to come to the hospital with them, presumably to identify Kitty's body as her roommate. The saddest thing is that even though they were a couple, they wouldn't have been recognised as such by law. If Kitty had survived and had been in hospital, Mary Ann would have had no rights. She wouldn't have been considered family, she wouldn't have been able to visit her. But being a roommate was good enough to identify a body though. There are some reports that Carl went round to see Mary Ann on the night Kitty died and they drank together, but he never told her what he witnessed in the stairwell that night. Kitty's funeral took place a few days later, where her family refused to acknowledge Mary Ann and Kitty's relationship. Of course, the Genovese family were a strict Catholic family, and lesbianism probably wasn't much in keeping with their religious beliefs. Although we don't know exactly if Kitty's family knew of her sexuality or of her relationship with Mary Ann, we can probably assume their parents did and just brushed it under the carpet, as so many of the older generations do. Mary Ann says that to Kitty's parents, Kitty was just her friend, and it doesn't seem that her siblings knew anything of her sexuality until years later. But that doesn't mean the police didn't soon clock on to the fact that they were a lesbian couple. After Kitty's death, Mary Ann was questioned extensively and she was actually considered a key suspect, despite the fact that I'm sure Carl Ross told them that he saw a man stabbing Kitty. But at this time, same-sex partners were often suspected in violent crimes under the motivation of jealousy. It was argued that gay people were much more likely to be jealous than heterosexuals, which makes me really laugh because in my experience I've actually found the opposite to be true, but I can't speak for everyone. At first, Mary Ann insisted to the police that they were just roommates before eventually breaking and telling them that they were a couple, something she later said she wishes she never did. It didn't make the situation easier for anyone involved. She was eventually left alone by the police just days later when they found the actual perpetrator, but now she was outed to the community and people didn't want to associate with her any longer. She was an outcast dealing with the grief of losing the love of her life alongside everything else. 5 days after the murder, the police arrested 29-year-old Winston Mosley, a married father of two. He was actually arrested when he was caught stealing a television from someone's home, which was something he did quite often it seems, and was confronted by some neighbours. The neighbours called the police and stopped Mosley from being able to escape, which is a very nice juxtaposition to the apparent lack of neighbourly action in Kitty's case. Of course, the papers didn't ever report on that though because it didn't fit their narrative. When arrested, he ended up confessing to the murder of not only Kitty but two others as well. It was suggested after psychiatric exams that he was a necrophile, and when it came to his trial not long after, there was no doubt that he'd murdered Kitty, describing the attack in detail. Despite this, Mary Ann had to take the stand as a legal witness under the guise of a friend and a roommate, not as a partner, although the prosecutors did know the truth. They were afraid that bringing Kitty's sexuality into the trial might skew the jury's opinion of her, and perhaps even to the point of giving her killer a lighter sentence. Sexuality was a huge deal here. Mosley was found guilty, obviously, and was given a death sentence, which was later reduced to a life sentence in '67 when New York State abolished most capital punishment. In early 1968, he injured himself by shoving an entire soup can up his rectum, and then had to be transferred to a local hospital for treatment. Taking advantage of the lower security, he escaped and went on another rampage. He broke into an occupied house and called a cleaning service to send a maid over. When the maid arrived, he raped her multiple times. She escaped but was too scared to call the police herself, so contacted the homeowners and warned them that someone was there. The homeowners called the police, but they didn't care enough to come and investigate, which is an exact example of the kind of thing I referenced earlier in the video. So the couple who owned the house went over to investigate themselves, only being confronted with Mosley with a gun. They were tied up and robbed, the woman was raped, and then Mosley left. He then broke into another house, took more hostages, and was finally arrested again. He died in prison in 2016, aged 81, and was one of the state's longest-serving inmates. The New York Times article in 1964 immortalised Kitty's case into something it never really was. But how did that come to be? The Metropolitan editor of the Times at the time was a man called A.M. Rosenthal. When the murder first happened, there was a very short 4-paragraph mention of Kitty in the paper just 2 days later, but nobody really paid too much attention. 2 weeks later, it was suddenly front page news. It turns out that Mr. Rosenthal was good friends with the police commissioner Michael J. Murphy, and they had lunch together not long after the murder. Murphy told Rosenthal that the Queen's story was one for the books, that 38 people had watched a woman being killed and nobody did a thing to save her life. Nobody called the police. The man who was the district attorney at the time would later tell Jim Rassenberger, who was an author, "I don't know where that came from, the 38. I didn't count 38. We only found half a dozen people who saw what was going on that we could use." But it didn't matter to Rosenthal the exact number. It made a fantastic front page story for him. He tasked one of his journalists, Martin Gansberg, and from there the story took on a life of its own. It changed social psychology as we know it today. The Times did print a slight retraction decades later. An editor's note written October 2016 on the online article reads, "Later reporting by the Times and others has called into question significant elements of this account." But Rosenthal still stands by his article. He says even if the numbers are off, it led to too many good things to be called a bad article, too much research. Maybe he has a point, but it turned Kitty Genovese into a symbol of something that wasn't even true. I'm not particularly sure I'd want my death to go down in history under a false narrative. But Kitty's murder, along with others, did lead to the introduction of 911. It was clear that a direct link to emergency services was needed, and it was soon made. Her death also led to social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané researching and popularising the idea of the bystander effect. Whether or not that's actually relevant to the case of Kitty Genovese, though, is up for debate. Because I don't think I'd be able to put it into words better myself, I want to end this video with 2 quotes I feel sum up my general thoughts and feelings on this whole thing. In an article entitled "Don't Look Now," written by Angus Johnston for the New Enquiry, he writes, "The Genovese story isn't just a story of individual moral culpability. It's also a story about malign and corrupt institutions and the corrosive effects these institutions have on our lives." And then Kevin Cook, the author of Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America, has said, "Kitty Genovese was not killed by apathy. She was killed by a monster named Winston Mosley." Perhaps the lesson to learn from Kitty's case isn't that of the bystander effect, because whilst it is relevant in so many cases, it wasn't really here. The lesson to learn is how one ill-informed article written in 1964 has formed the basis of many a psychology class over the years, only for it all to be wrong. This newspaper article was written to sell on the front page, but it's influenced an untrue narrative for decades. Perhaps the better thing to study on the back of this is the effects of that. What other false narratives do we take as truth in our everyday lives? I'm very aware that this video is probably going to be a bit controversial. I intended to look into this case and the bystander effect and just write about that. But the more I read about the story, the more I realised how untrue so much of the narrative surrounding it is, and I couldn't just talk about this case without talking about all of the context around it, because I think that's so important. I think it's important that Kitty was a lesbian woman. I think it's important that Carl Ross himself was likely a gay man. We don't know that for sure, but that seems to be where all the evidence points. It's important to know that Sophia Farrar did get dressed and go and sit with her and help her while she died. It's important to know that the NYPD were corrupt to its very core. It's important to know that domestic violence was seen by the family courts, not criminal courts. It was okay for a husband to beat his wife, and people weren't expected to do anything about it. If you look at this case at face value, then yes, it looks awful, but really once you delve deeper into it, there's a lot of context that you need to know. And I think on that note, I'm going to end this video here. Thank you so much for watching. If you know of any other cases like this, where the narrative that we know today, or the narrative that is taken as gospel, is actually false, or things have been changed to sort of fit the media, then please let me know. I found this so interesting to look into. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.